Hello mate and welcome. This is I don't know what to call it a webinar because that sounds really pretentious, but basically over the process of the last couple of years, I've been extensively working on games to put on Steam. Not just my own, I've been working on some other titles as well, helping other people out with coding and such. And I thought I'd put together a kind of a checklist or a list of things that you kind of need, core skills that you need in order to be a solo developer or a small team. Realistically, any size team needs to have all of these skills in it, but it's a little bit easier if you hire someone to do each specific job and so on. So as a solo developer, we tend to neglect certain skills, or we treat some like they're more important than others, and maybe that's not necessarily accurate. So the purpose of this is to we're going to talk about the key skills required to develop a video game, and I'm also going to touch on things to avoid in order to maximize relative commercial success. So when I say relative commercial success, what I mean is don't expect your first game to make you thousands and thousands of dollars. Be more realistic in it. If you release your first game and you sell 10 copies, that would be a relative commercial success. Because it's a learning curve, okay? So the first thing that you need is obvious: imagination. If you don't have imagination, you're going nowhere, because you need to come up with ideas that are unique, innovative, and engaging. There's no point just ripping off someone else's idea unless you're going to bring something new to the table. For example, my game Freezon DT, which is on Steam, is very similar in its execution to Phasmophobia, but I've done things differently, i.e. it's not just another Phasmophobia clone. There are different things that you need to do, and that we take the idea of Phasmophobia and we add to it. We don't just do a direct copy, because no one's going to buy a game that is a direct copy of another game. Why would they, when they could just go out and buy the original? One example of that is for example, Animal Crossing New Horizons, or whatever it was called, was a hugely successful game, and not long after it came out, hundreds and hundreds of clones or attempts to mimic it came out on Steam, because obviously Animal Crossing was a Nintendo Switch only game. You couldn't buy it on the PC, obviously, unless you had an emulator and you pirated it or whatever, but that's more hassle than it's worth just to play a game. Anyway, so there were literally hundreds of clones that came out, but whilst a couple of them did okay, they sold plenty of copies or whatever, the majority of players were charging these back, getting refunds, because it was garbage. It wasn't as good as the original, or it wasn't close enough to the original either, which is a very tricky scenario to be in, because if you are going to make a knockoff of a game like Animal Crossing, you need it to have some of those key features that Animal Crossing has, but without straying into just plagiarism, because you can get sued to buggery for that. Having said that, though, there's no such thing as a bad idea in the imagine stage. You can take any idea and turn it into a video game. Some of the most successful video games that have ever been made are really bonkers ideas that nobody probably thought was going to work. But one or two people persist with that bonkers idea, and it turns out to be a hugely successful game. Let's even talk about Minecraft. I mean, when Notch was developing Minecraft, it probably sounded to most people like the most boring game in the world. I'm going to make a game where it's entirely made up of 1 meter blocks, that dirt, stone, and you mine and dig and build. That just sounds like boredom to me, but it actually works really well. It's kind of got liminal qualities to it as well. The next one is organization. You know, the cliche is fail to plan and plan to fail. It is true. You can't just dive in and start doing a video game. You need to be organized. You need to, ideally, you need to manage version control, which means you're going to have to learn to use Git or something similar that allows you to track changes and roll them back if they're bad. You really need to keep logs and to-do lists. When I say logs, you need to keep a log of any changes that you've made. You need to keep a log of any work that you've done and how long it took you to do, i.e. how many hours you've worked. And to-do lists should be live documents. They should be something that is constantly changing, because you might start something and not quite finish it. If it's not finished, it doesn't get crossed off the to-do list. Maybe you will amend the item in the to-do list, but don't just remove something if it's half done. And that also goes for in the support period, which we'll talk about later. Deadlines aren't compulsory, especially if you're an indie dev, because one of the perks of being self-employed is that you can kind of manage your own time. Having said that, though, it's a really good idea to keep yourself to deadlines anyway, because otherwise nothing ever gets done. You'll chop and change between jobs all over the place, and you'll end up getting lost. It's very easy to do. Also, once you start marketing your game, which again we'll talk about in a minute, but once you start trying to sell your game to people, there is an expectation that you will keep to the deadlines that you set yourself. So if you say, I'm going to sell this game on the 25th of September, players are going to be pissed if you don't sell the game on the 25th of September, especially if you don't announce that it's not going on sale until the day before or really close to it. You may remember Ark Survival Evolved. When that was in early access, the developers announced that they were going to do full release, the 1.0 release version, and they announced it, I think it was kind of close to this time of year actually, a few years ago. And they did a live stream about a week before, and they were all bigging up this new expansion, bearing in mind that they released 3 expansions while the game was still in early access, which is kind of sketchy already. But anyway, like a week before it was due to be full release, they did this live stream where they were talking about the amazing features of this new expansion and how great the expansion was going to be, and then very casually dropped in the middle of a sentence, oh, by the way, release isn't happening for another 3 months now, and then kept talking. They kind of didn't give the audience time for that to sink in. So quite a lot of people, myself included, were sat there, and it was a bit of a gut punch, because we were really looking forward to 1.0 release, because there were a lot of bug fixes and stuff planned. So, again, if you're going to give yourself deadlines, you need to make sure they're realistic and you need to stick to them. You probably heard personal trainers and other people on the internet talk about SMART goals all the time. And we kind of brush it off as just nonsense, but it is actually really important that your goals need to be specific. They need to be measurable. They need to be achievable, which is really important. They need to be realistic or relevant, and they also need to be time-based. In other words, you need to set yourself a deadline. You need to say, I'm going to work on this tree and it's going to take me 3 days, and stick to it. If it doesn't take you if it doesn't kind of come together, if you don't manage it in 3 days, then that's fair enough. You don't have to beat yourself up about it, but you have to kind of give yourself these milestones, these goals to achieve. Otherwise, things just get left, and you give in to the temptation to just sit and play Minecraft all day instead of actually working on your game or whatever. Happy days. Coding. Here we go. Okay, coding. I've written here that coding is the language that you use to explain to the computer what it must do and what the rules are. Obviously, if you have experience with coding, you already know that. But if you're not a code-oriented game designer or game developer, then hopefully this kind of demystifies it a little bit. Coding is the building blocks that we use to build the game with, but most coders are not the people who decide how those building blocks are going to be put together. Most of the time, a coder is someone who gets set a task. I need a piece of code that does this. And then they go away and they do it, and then they give it back, and then they get feedback saying, oh, well, actually, can we tweak it so that it does it a little bit more like this? So you end up changing your code quite frequently to meet the needs of another person. Now, if you're a solo developer, you're going to have to be both of those people, which you might think makes life a bit easier, but it really doesn't, because you'll go down the rabbit hole in the code side of things, and then you might end up neglecting the other aspects. So what I'm saying essentially is compartmentalization is very important. If you are going to be the person doing the coding and the game designing, you need to kind of do one thing at a time and don't try to amalgamate the two. Don't sit there writing down code and then 10 minutes later implement that code, and then because you can get yourself in a muddle, you need to kind of split yourself down the middle with that one. It's also really important to just remember that coding is an important part of game development, but it's not the whole story. Game design, this is the other half of that puzzle I was talking about. It's not the same as coding. Design means developing the big picture as well as the minutiae. You're the person, the game designer is going to be the person who ultimately decides how the game is going to play, what the game functions are going to be, basically you are designing the game, but you're not boring down into the code. When you're doing the game design, you're not overly concerned with how the programmers are going to achieve what it is you want. You're just the person that's going to decide, how am I going to take the player from this place to the next place in as fun and engaging way as possible. Heavily focused on taking the ideas from the imagination phase, the ideas phase, and making it work in a game. But that also means deciding when something isn't going to work, or something that you thought might be a good idea is not necessarily implementable. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea, it just means not for this particular game. Then we get to probably the second most important part of the game is the art. Probably more important even so than the code, to be honest. You're the person, the artist is the person who decides how the game's going to look. You're the person who's going to do all of the work to make the game look like that. And it is possibly the most time-consuming part of game development, because you need to develop. If you're doing a 2D game, you need to design all of the sprites. You need to make sure that any animations have all of the sprites designed and drawn for them. If you're doing it in 3D, you need to deal with not only the building of the characters, but also the texturing. You also need to do the rigging and the animation. So art is a very broad topic which contains many, many subtopics that you kind of need to learn to master. If you're going to do a 2D game, then obviously 3D software has its limitations. But having said that, a lot of animation is achievable within Blender and actually quite good. It's quite a good piece of software for it. Other things like Sprite, Maya, 3ds Max, Photoshop and all that. Obviously the tools that you're going to use, it's up to you to learn how to use them. But there are plenty of tutorials on places like Udemy. There's even a bunch on this channel that you can get away with, the basics. I don't go into too much depth into a lot of these things, but I give you enough to get you started. As I said, huge, broad topic which contains lots and lots and lots of different subcategories, and you need to kind of learn to master all of them. But if you're not a 3D artist, you still need to develop a proficiency, because if you end up outsourcing and paying somebody else to do your artwork, which if you do that, that's great, that person is going to have a saturation point, a limitation of how many times you can keep sending things back to them and saying, oh, I don't like this, can you do it this way? There's going to come a point where they're going to say, you're going to have to give me more money for this because it's taking too much time. That is the nature of the creative process, unfortunately. It's much easier if it's only a minor tweak, if you're able to go and do that yourself, because it means that you haven't got to keep bothering an artist. So graphic design isn't vital, but it really helps with things like UI design. Really, really helpful to have some kind of idea of the theory behind all of that sort of thing. And I've got a photography background, so kind of there are some crossover points there. But again, the amount of information that's available on sites like Udemy and Skillshare and things like that, you should be spoiled for choice for tutorials and things that can lead you down the right path on these things. The next one is kind of paired with the art design, and that's the audio design. Games need audio. There are very, very few. In fact, I can't even remember a single game that's done well that hasn't had some kind of soundtrack on it. We're talking about music and special effects. I mean special effects, I just mean sound effects, like simple things like when you click on a UI item, giving the player feedback that that click has been registered is really useful and really important. And sound effect helps build atmosphere and make the game feel alive and real. You'd be amazed how dead a game feels if you just turn the sound off when you're playing a game. Like, I know a lot of people used to do that when they played MMOs like World of Warcraft, City of Heroes. They would turn the game audio off because they just got sick of hearing the sound effects, which is fair enough. because in MMOs they tend to be very repetitive to the point where you're just like, oh my god, I'm so bored of hearing that sound effect. But for a game, AAA games, for example, have a very wide and broad story where there's a lot going on. You'll tend to find that they've put a lot of time and money into developing a really solid soundtrack as well. Now, there are AI tools out there. The problem with using AI tools for art and music, either or, is that you cannot copyright anything that's been created by AI. So if somebody was to steal your soundtrack or to start borrowing things from your game's art, you can't do anything about it because it's not copyrightable. Also, they tend to be very samey. If you've ever used one of the audio generators, the AI music generators, the first time you use it, you're like, wow, this is amazing, this is great, I could do my entire game soundtrack with this. And then as you try to use it more and more, you start to notice the patterns and you start to realize that the player is going to pick up on this being AI stuff from the very start. Now, as an ethical developer, you should probably put somewhere in the game's description that there is AI art or AI music used anyway, because some people are just properly against it, some people are very pro, whatever. But these are the things that you need to take into consideration. To get better results, you're far better off learning to use something like Fruity Loop Studio or Audacity or whatever to develop your own music and your own soundtrack, your own sound effects to the game, so that you have a unique product for one thing, and also that it's more you in the game rather than somebody else. Having said that though, stock sound effects for things like doors opening, footsteps and things like that, most of the time they go unnoticed, so don't worry too much about it. Next one is definitely marketing. Marketing is the most overlooked aspect. I've screwed up so many times by not putting enough time and energy into marketing my games. Freeze on DT did terribly in sales because I just didn't bother marketing it, and organic growth on platforms like Epic Store, Steam, itch.io doesn't happen. You might get 5 or 6 people who stumble across your game, but most players don't go trawling through the archives of indie games to try and find a game that they want to play. Most people will just log on to Steam, they'll look at the recommendations for what they are, they'll get through their discovery queue. Most of them won't pay any attention to their curators, recommendations or whatever else. If it's not on the front page, you probably aren't going to get many sales. So you need to invest in basically getting day one sales and wish lists up. In other words, you need to market your game very early on in the development process using social media, live streaming the development, and paying live streamers. Unfortunately, yes, it is paying live streamers because, contrary to popular belief, they don't just randomly pick games to play. They are paid to play them. To play the game once it's playable, you don't want a live streamer playing a game that's barely playable. They're not play testers. They are people who are there to market your game. You're paying them to sell your game, to make people want to play it. If it's crap, they're not going to do that, are they? They will play it because you've paid them to do it, but they are under no obligation to say nice things about your game, and they can't make a game that crashes or that's full of glitches look good no matter how hard they try. So you have to bear these things in mind. So as I said, you need to start this really early in the development process, ideally as soon as the game art suddenly becomes usable, because you want to give yourself as much of a run up as possible. Launch day is really important, particularly on platforms like Steam. If your day one sales are crap, the chances are you're never going to end up on anybody's recommended feed. If you can get a decent number of sales on the day of release, then you stand a much better chance of getting some organic growth from that, because you will find that Steam will put it on people's discovery queues and recommended feeds and things like that. So yeah, really important to get that good run up and start selling the game long before it's ready to be released. The service lifecycle, here we go. This is important, okay? This is again something that's really, really often overlooked. When you start developing a video game and you sell it, you are obliged to provide support. In other words, fixing bugs, dealing with customer issues if they're struggling to get the game to run or something like that. You can't just ignore them, okay? The days of developing a game on a cartridge and then selling it, and if there are problems with it, tough, those are long gone. Nowadays, with the digital marketplace, remember that you're no longer selling your game, you're selling players licenses to play the game. And with that comes the assumption or the expectation that you are going to support them throughout the duration of that license, which means indefinitely, realistically. But I think generally speaking, there is a cut-off period where a player, when they buy a game, they realize how old the game is and they don't necessarily expect it. But again, the expectation is if the game's been out 10 years, that most of the bugs should have been fixed by that point. And if they haven't, then you're going to be in for a rough ride, let's put it that way, okay? So, as I said, players expect bugs to be resolved. You can't just ignore players. If they report bugs through the proper channels, and that's quite an important distinction, then you are reasonably expected to be resolving those issues. Now, when I say through the proper channels, I mean if someone just starts ranting on X or Twitter, if you want to be old school, about your game, and you don't have a Twitter account for whatever reason, then you could argue that it's fair enough that you didn't resolve the issue because you didn't know about it. But if you have provided your players with a means to give you feedback, i.e. Steam discussion groups or a support email address, and you receive feedback through those channels stating that there is an issue with your game, then realistically you should be fixing it as soon as humanly possible, putting out a hot fix within a couple of days or however long it takes. At the end of the day, you're a human being and you have your own needs and things like that. But realistically, your paying customers should kind of be being looked after. And then last, definitely not least, is, well, it's not actually last, it's second to last, but collaboration. Even as a solo dev, you need feedback from people and sanity checks. In other words, you need to talk to people who are not your friends and family, that will give you honest feedback about the product. Is it playable? Is it engaging? Does it look good? Does it sound good? Are there any things that other people would change? You don't necessarily have to make those changes, but you need somebody else. You can't sit there in an echo chamber throughout the entire development process, because there's nobody that's going to tell you that your idea is crap. You're certainly not going to tell yourself your idea is crap unless you've got anxiety problems like some of us have. But you need other people's input. And also you need play testers. You can't play test a game yourself again because you know how the game works. You need people who don't know how the game works to tell you, is it easy to learn? Did they have any problems? Things like that. Let me get into play testing. You should do a little yourself, but get other people to do the majority of it, as I said, because you need people who don't know how to play the game to give you that honest feedback and tell you, this game's crap, I can't figure out how it works. It needs to be structured and useful. It's not just a free game for your mates. You can't just say to your mate, do you want to be a playtester, and give them a Steam key and then just let them toddle off on their own. And because they might never tell you, if the game's crap and they're your friend, they're not going to tell you if it's crap. You need people who are not necessarily professional game testers, but you need to give them instructions. You need to give them testing routines, and you need to give them deadlines for reports. Carry out these tests, and then by the end of the week, I want a report saying whether the test was successful. If it wasn't successful, what was the thing that did happen, and so on. Playtesting is one of those skills that is often underestimated because people just think, oh, well, you just play video games all day. They're like, yeah, but it's not like I'm going out and playing, I don't know, Elden Ring for 3 weeks and having a jolly old time and not telling the developer about bugs and things like that. It is, repeating the same level over and over and over and over again and doing slightly different things just to report back on if there are any things, or carrying out the same interaction many times to see if it functions correctly every single time. Trust me, being a playtester is not as much fun as you might think it is. Self-motivation is definitely the last one, okay? And the fact is, nobody is going to make you do it. Nobody else cares. Your friends and family won't tell you the truth because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Most people will expect you to fail, and plenty of people will drag you down if you let them. Like, I've released quite a few games at this point, and I have yet to release a game that's broken any records, that's set the world on fire. That doesn't mean I'm a bad developer. It just means I've had a lot of projects and I'm learning a lot as I go along. But people will be more than happy to remind me. In fact, when I post videos of my upcoming projects on YouTube or on Twitch or whatever, there's always at least one smarmy fucker who will kindly come along and remind me of how many other projects I've done that haven't succeeded. And it's like, yes, I know, I'm very aware of that. I still live in my own, I live in my own house now, albeit with a mortgage, but I'm very aware of my lack of commercial success in the projects that I have currently released. But there's always someone who's quite happy to come along and remind me, and they will do the same thing to you. Unfortunately, there are people who just enjoy being down on other people, or perhaps they get some kind of ego boost out of putting other people down. Whatever their reason is, plenty of people out there. Unfortunately, you're going to have to, you can't ignore those people, because occasionally someone will say something that's actually useful and relevant. So you kind of have to listen to all of the feedback and all of the opinions, but you also have to learn to switch off the part of your brain that takes it personally and learn to use what's given to you to your advantage. Motivating yourself is one of the hardest parts of being a solo or an indie dev small team, because you do have to rather kick your own ass and force yourself to do things. Unfortunately, being a game developer is like any other job. You spend 364 days a year doing monotonous crap so that you can do one day a year doing something exciting. That's just the reality of being a grown-up. All right, guys, thank you ever so much. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I will see you in the next one, which will be soon. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, all right? Bye-bye.